We've already talked about some of the farmers and their problems that they were having at this point in time. What we'll look at today is at those problems a little more in depth. First of all was the weather. You can imagine as a farmer that the weather would have a major impact on their crops. Drought would seriously harm their crop yields. They just wouldn't have enough harvest to sell at market. If that harvest that they did have, if the prices on those crops fell, they would not bring enough money home to support their families. Increasing debt. We also talked about this very vicious cycle, having to go into debt to buy more land in order to grow more crops, all in turn putting them further into debt, especially if their crops weren't coming to market and selling as much as they needed them to. Farmers were also very dependent on railroads. They had to use the railroads to get their crops to the East Coast, that's where the demand was. They're also going to need cheaper money. We'll talk about what cheaper money means here in just a few minutes. But I do want you to know that deflation means falling prices and inflation means rising prices. You will hear many people talk about inflation when you look at over time. That's why a loaf of bread might have cost been a little cheaper even 5-10 years ago from what it is now. That inflation happens over time and causes the prices to rise. Railroads were one of the worst enemies of farmers. They completely took advantage of farmers in every way they could. They used their connections in the government to take advantage of government contracts. They accepted bribes. They valued their stock. They said it was worth more than it actually was, which is stock watering. They unfairly priced their different rates. They would charge more, for example, for a short haul, which means going a shorter distance as opposed to a long haul. They also used rebates, or they would give money back to very large customers. This was a problem for your small farmer because they simply did not have the same means to get those rebates and save a little bit of money. Eventually, what begins to happen is that farmers look for any reason to get together. Remember, we talked yesterday that isolation was a major problem. Isolation was going to be solved by farmers deciding to get together every once in a while for various social gatherings. That is why the Grange, which was also known as the Patrons of Husbandry, began. This was a social group that eventually evolves into a political group. What these farmers realized was that they were getting together and they were discussing the same problems day after day, month after month, year after year. So they decided to become a political organization in an attempt to try to change some of the policies at their state level. Specifically, they really wanted the regulation of the railroads, meaning to tell the railroads to stop taking advantage of them. And they were successful. They got laws passed that were called Granger laws. This is going to regulate the railroads. Unfortunately for the Grangers, these laws would be struck down in a court case called Wabash versus Illinois in 1887. It was struck down because federal law regulates anything that crosses state lines. And obviously, the railroad industry crosses state lines, which is what's going to give the federal government jurisdiction. Now, while these Granger laws were struck down, it is going to be replaced by the federal agency called the Interstate Commerce Act, which is going to create the Interstate Commerce Commission that will regulate commerce, which is trade. If you don't know what commerce is, make a note that commerce is trade, which also in turn attempts to regulate the railroads. The other thing that Grangers really wanted was currency reform. Currency is another word for your money. So they want to change their money system, which we will look at in just a minute. What I'd like for you to do is draw a line from the Grange in your notes over to populism. The Grange mostly represented your farmers. The populist movement is going to represent both farmers and workers. The Populist Party will eventually take the place of the Grange. Remember, it was for farmers and workers. It had very strong Midwest support, and it was a reform-based party, meaning they wanted to bring changes. Their platform, called the Omaha Platform, is going to include several planks. The planks of a party's platform are going to be the issues that they support. The first one is going to be an increased money supply. Farmers wanted more cash in their pockets that would enable them to pay off their debts. It also is going to include an income tax. An income tax is going to be important because farmers wanted there to be a tax on their income instead of on their land. Many farmers had a lot of land. However, just because they had a lot of land did not mean that they were making a lot of money. So instead of their land being taxed, they wanted their income to be taxed instead. They also wanted secret ballots. That way, their vote would not be influenced. They also wanted an 8-hour workday. This is going to be mainly for your workers, like your factory workers. They did not want to decrease their amount of pay. They just wanted to work 8 hours a day and that be standard instead of 10, 12, 14-hour workdays. They also were looking for immigration control. This should sound familiar to you because we see many people who argue for immigration control for similar reasons, and that was they wanted to protect their jobs. We are now going to look at currency. The Panic of 1893 is called a panic because our economy was in a recession, meaning basically the economy wasn't doing well. So many people began to promote both a silver and gold standard for currency, meaning that our paper money or greenbacks were backed up by, instead of just gold, which was very stable and expensive, they wanted it to be backed up by both silver and gold. This is an idea called bimetallism, which just means that they want our greenbacks backed by both silver and gold. This would also create a larger money supply. However, even though it would create a larger money supply, that money, or greenbacks, would be worth less. This is a confusing concept, but remember, farmers wanted more cash in their pockets to pay off their debtors. So there's that greenbacks issued on those gold and silver instead of simply gold. The gold standard, which is what it was already on and remained on, was going to be much more stable because gold reserves were limited, which is why it is more stable. The election of 1896 was dominated on the issue of currency reform, meaning the real issue that most of the candidates were talking about was currency reform, or changing what our money was backed by. William McKinley was the Republican candidate and got a lot of support from the East Coast and your wealthier Americans. He also supported the gold standard, or that more stable money supply. William Jennings Bryan was going to run as a Democrat, and then after he gave a very famous speech called the Cross of Gold speech, where he talked about how your farmers and working class people were going to be crucified on this cross of gold, meaning they were the ones who were suffering because of this gold standard policy with our currency. He was a supporter of free silver or bimetallism. This speech was so popular and gained so much support that he was also endorsed by the Populists. When McKinley wins this election in 1896, it is going to bring an end to the populist movement. That does not mean that populism itself completely goes away. It simply means that all of those different planks that were in that Omaha platform were simply swallowed up by the more dominant Republican and Democratic parties. So their ideas don't go away, it's just the party itself does. So the People's Party, or the Populist Party, dies after the election of 1896.